Okay, how's everybody doing tonight? Okay. Hello, my name is Max. I am a faithful believer and follower of Jesus Christ. I struggle with anger, anxiety, fear, and pride, among other things. This is my testimony as it stands today. I was born at home on a stormy night in November in a house off H Street in Anchorage to an oddly matched couple. My father was already in his early 30s with an established career. He was college educated from a stereotypical middle-class family, while my mother was in her mid-20s with 3 older children she had no custody over in another state and her first divorce under her belt. She came from a deeply splintered family full of abuse and mistreatment. She gave birth to my oldest sister when she was still in her teens. In adulthood, my mother would tell me I was her most wanted child. This statement would be deeply hurtful because she didn't want me for me. I was a placeholder for the children she didn't have. I was a year old before my parents got married. I had a relatively happy early childhood in Anchorage, but many of my earliest memories are of being alone, something that would be a hallmark for much of my life. I vaguely remember seeing my 3 older siblings once or twice as a very small child. But for the most part, it was just my parents and I until I was 4 years old, when my younger sister came along. This was the first in a series of big changes in my life. After my sister was born, my parents would decide that the house in Anchorage wasn't big enough and move our family out to Wasilla. The next several years were fairly standard. My father was gone a lot because he commuted to Anchorage for work, and I was in daycare and then preschool. Between 5 and 7, I'm vague on the ages, I would have my first experience to human sexuality with a friend the same age who I spent a great deal of time with. These interactions were, of course, to be kept secret and not talked about to the grown-ups. Otherwise, we couldn't keep building our forts, and we would get in trouble. Associating secrecy and shame with sexuality early on in my young brain. Around the age of 7, another big change. My older sister would come to live with us. She was followed the next year by my other older sister and my older brother. Our house was full, but the cracks were starting to show in the odd couple's foundation. I had friends during this period, but the overwhelming memory I have from this time is again being alone, playing outside, or reading. While possessing a rich inner fantasy life, I struggled with being in reality. My first exposure to adult entertainment came around this time. I distinctly remember sitting and watching a VHS recording of the animated heavy metal film with my older brother while he was babysitting. Definitely not something I should have seen at that age. Around the same time my older siblings moved in, my parents had started a restaurant, one of my mother's lifelong dreams. It was awesome as a kid to experience being in a restaurant kitchen and seeing all the things that went on. But this would eventually be the end of my parents' marriage. The stress of owning a business and my father working in town trying to keep things afloat would eventually drive my parents apart. I am sure there were signs, but I don't remember them fighting. There is a distinct memory of finding cigarettes in the house and taking them to my mom. She would eventually sit me down and explain to me that she knew I had seen her smoking and that I shouldn't do it. I think that was meant to be a secret, but I honestly had no idea that it was going on. Eventually, my parents would sit down with my younger sister and I in the living room and explain that they were separating. My mom would be moving out with my older siblings, and we would continue to live with my dad. It would only be years later, as an adult, I would realize how lucky I was in this case. My father, younger sister, and I became our own team. We were small, but I think we still did things together. The memories are pretty vague here. The big blue house we lived in would be sold, and we moved into a small rental. My mother moved into a duplex with my grandfather, 2 of my older siblings, and her new boyfriend. My mom's boyfriend was a face I already knew. He had been the dishwasher at my parents' restaurant. I spent a great deal of time over the next year or so with my grandfather watching old movies and things. My older siblings would start to spin out of control, getting involved with drugs and alcohol. I was somehow insulated from this, but I have memories of screaming matches between them and my mom. My mother took us, sometime in this period I would also have my first experience with church. My mother took us no more than 3 times to a church off Bogart. It was so strange to me, and I felt foolish because I didn't know how to act or any of the answers to the Sunday school questions. My parents' separation happened the year I entered third grade. I was pushed into the gifted program at school around this time and was also given counseling with a family therapist. I remember sitting in the office being asked if I understood what was going on. To me, it was a stupid question, of course. I understood everyone was still a family, but things were just different. I had started to emotionally bury and detach things already at this point, and started building a distrust of counselors. My younger sister and I would start going to daycare after school when Mom wasn't able to watch us, as my dad was still working in Anchorage. I continued to compartmentalize, suppress my emotions, and retreat into my fantasy worlds, disassociating with books and video games. This was also the first year I spent the summer with my grandparents in California. I could eat as much as I wanted because my grandmother loved to spoil me with all the junk food I could want. I also got to hang out with my aunt and cousin, who was the same age as me. My cousin to this day is still closer to me than any of my siblings. It was in California I would also start to feel the weight of family expectation. My grandfather would start to remind me of my duty to carry on my family name. I was expected to have children, especially sons. This was also the first time I would hear about the importance of riding the horse, not shoveling the manure. Expectations were high. We were the best, and I had to uphold that. Life moved on. I made it through 5th grade and was ready to transition into middle school when my dad decided to move us into Anchorage so he could be closer to work. We still saw my mother on the weekends. She had married my stepfather by this point and was pregnant with my new younger brother. My older sisters had moved out of the house and my older brother enlisted in the Army. I would see less and less of them from this point on. Even today, it has been almost a decade since I have seen any of my older siblings. Anchorage was a huge change. My father worked a lot and we had few connections in town, so my sister and I became latchkey kids when we were with my dad. I was also back in elementary school, not middle school, like I had been planning on, and struggled to make friends. I was awkward and had my head buried in 600-page fantasy novels, far above my grade level at this point. My world was in the pages of those books, or TV shows, or video games. The people who would normally have directed my personality as a kid were absent at this point. No older siblings, Dad worked all the time, and I started to base my personality on the characters in my stories, with ridiculous notions of how to act and silly dashes of romanticism. That year I even bought flowers for every girl in my grade on Valentine's Day, just so I could give a flower to the girl I liked. As I noted, my father worked all the time. If it wasn't working at home after dinner on his laptop, it was cleaning the house or folding laundry. He never sat still, didn't really have hobbies, never took a break. Things that were modeled for me then that would cause me strife and anxiety later in life. But we always had enough with my dad. There was food and we rented movies. Things were good. However, I also had large amounts of time alone. While my sister would embrace after-school activities, that drew my father's focus and attention. I was left home alone with a computer, unrestricted access to the World Wide Web, and all that that implies. Pardon me. Long weekends with my mother were different. I was exposed to lack for the first time in my life. I would struggle to understand what the book of coupons, in reality food stamps, my mom used to pay for groceries were, or why we couldn't buy the same brands we bought with my dad. She fought frequently with my stepfather, and they smoked a lot. On the rare occasions when my older sisters were around, they all smoked too, but always told me not to. Eventually, my mother's house would burn down. Many things from my early childhood would be lost in the fire. She bounced around to several houses then before ending up in Big Lake for a few years. The year I turned 15, she left the state with my younger brother and my stepfather, making my circle of people even smaller. I had already developed issues trusting that people would stay around me at this point. Between summers with my grandparents and weekends with my mother, maintaining friendships outside of school was hard. I retreated further and further into my books and games. Everything else was secondary to disassociating and running away. Middle school and high school were much the same. I would struggle with the anxiety of meeting my family's and teachers' expectations, pushing back on the expected high performance with refusal to do work and avoidance of tasks. High school got somewhat better. I would make what I thought were real lasting friendships and connections for the first time. While my outer mood would improve, I would struggle with depression and self-harm as the years went by. There was always an internal struggle with my vision of self, the fantasy characters and ideals of my childhood, vying against the realities of the world. pardon me. Much of the time, I would feel like a monster, driven by my worst impulses. My weight was a constant struggle, and my addiction to porn, developed during my latchkey years, was crippling. While I was in high school, my father had dated a few women, including one who would bring church into my life for the second time. My father would be born again and start to attend church services regularly on Sunday nights. I was mad at him, and I wouldn't go. I couldn't understand why he would want to do church when he could be hanging out with me. He wasn't working. Couldn't he hang out with me? Wasn't I enough? I was barely able to graduate from high school, despite everyone's praise of my innate intelligence and ability. I knew deep down I was a disappointment to everyone. After school, I struggled to choose a path. I was fortunate enough that my grandparents had set money aside so I could go to college or trade school. I spent 6 months in Seward attending heavy diesel school, avoiding all social interactions down there, and racing back to Anchorage on the weekends. I had my first real girlfriend, and I was obsessed. I would do everything she asked and was happy to be emotionally manipulated and abused because I was finally getting the attention that I had been craving my whole life. This was the first in a series of manipulative and naive relationships I would be involved in. Eventually, anxiety and pressure would drive me to withdraw from Avtech and end up in my father's basement. He indulged several years of attempting college and half-working part-time jobs before he had enough. I had to start paying rent. I'm sorry.
You're doing great.
I'm okay. That was the state of things in 2010, when God stepped into my life in a major way. I would meet the woman who would eventually become my best friend and my wife. It can only be by the grace of God that she would see any value in someone who had squandered his every opportunity, who lived in his father's basement with no job and no prospects. I would get motivated to get my first serious job. I was committed. I was all in. I still struggled with porn, but gave that up for her. We got engaged, then found out that we were pregnant, and we moved the wedding date up. We rushed into things full of expectations and passion. I had a full-time minimum wage job working at a liquor store. We couldn't afford anything and lived in a friend's spare room in the valley. Then we had our first miscarriage. This was a huge hit for both of us, and we'd be the first of many huge challenges in our lives. I would get a better job, and we would move back to Anchorage, first in her grandparents' spare bedroom, then our first apartment. When we got pregnant again, my anxiety would start to become a bigger and bigger problem, leading to frequent arguments about expectations in our marriage. My hurt and insecurity was always on full display. Our oldest child was born in the midst of lots of stress and anxiety. My wife would be hospitalized due to medical complications until it was decided we needed to have a C-section. Our oldest child would be born 2 weeks early, and we were so happy. We moved to a new apartment and thought everything was normal. We were having a second baby and decided we could afford a house. We moved to Wasilla, and I was able to work from home. We would welcome our daughter into the world 15 months after our son. We started to see problems here. There were challenges with having 2 very small children in a house. The stress and arguments would deepen. My struggles with pornography would creep in from time to cause extra anguish to my wife and strife, all underpinned by my belief that I was not good enough and was not enough to care for my family. As he aged, our oldest would start to exhibit signs of developmental delay. We would get him to every therapist and counselor we could, but no one would ever tell us what was going on. It would take years of struggle by my wife to get a diagnosis of autism. I would hold resentment here and blame myself. This would lead to anger towards my wife and children, driven by fear of failure and those deep-seated familial expectations from my childhood. My family had to be the best. We have to ride the horse, not shovel manure. I would take a new position with my company where I was working in town instead of from home, adding extra stress to everything. In 2014, we would welcome our third child and second son into our home. I vividly remember New Year's Eve that year, holding him up to the living room window so he could watch the fireworks and seeing the smile on his face. 3 days later, we would wake up to his lifeless body. My wife would call for me in a panic that he wasn't breathing. I recall laughing it off. Surely she was just overreacting. I remember how cold his toes were when I shook them to wake him up, and I remember giving him CPR while my wife talked to the emergency dispatcher. This was the start of one of the most difficult times in my life and my marriage. My older son struggled to understand what happened and would begin to act out worse and worse and worse. My daughter would begin to act out at times as well, and I would become more desperate and more angry. I would yell at them and I would spank them out of frustration to make them stop. I would be woken by neighbors who found our oldest son in their homes looking for his brother and had to stop him from walking into traffic because he was trying to go to Jesus and his brother. I was angry and full of hate. We had gone to church off and on at this point, but not found a home church. I was the hardest on my wife. I would regularly yell at her, showering her with verbal abuse and mistreatment. My older children to this day are still affected by my actions in this time period. My marriage was rocky. People at work could barely talk to me because I had a dead child. And then that year, my best friend got wrongfully convicted of the death of his own child. So now was a great time to go back to school. My wife was supportive of the idea and got a job as the breadwinner for our house so I could pursue a degree. I was a stay-at-home dad for about 6 months, but continued to experience the same challenges with school that had plagued me in high school, lack of motivation, etc. I managed to get a certificate in my degree field, and just in time, we were pregnant again. I was so mad at my wife and accused her of trapping me into a kid I didn't want and wasn't ready for. I was awful to her. Our marriage continued to suffer. Our third son would be born in 2016, and things would get better for a few months. My new job was in Anchorage again, but it was the graveyard shift. I was barely awake and rarely present in my home. We would start attending church somewhat more regularly during this period. Then in 2017, I had had enough. None of my expectations of what a marriage should be were being met. I hated my wife and thought she felt the same. We were miserable. I decided divorce made sense. We separated after a huge outburst where I hit my oldest son, and my wife told me to leave. My wife wanted me to get anger management and counseling, but I would refuse. I didn't need a counselor. Counselors were no good. If it didn't work for my parents, right? I would go back to my father's basement again for 6 months, fully confident my wife and I were getting a divorce. Her grandparents helped her retain a lawyer, and I filled out all the paperwork, but we never submitted anything. God was working again, as always. My grandmother, who used to spoil me when I was a child, was genuinely mad at me, and I couldn't understand why. My whole life she'd been praying for me, and I didn't really even understand it. Over time, my wife and I would reconcile. Our fourth son was born January of 2018. Things were far from perfect, but we were starting relatively fresh with new understandings of relationships and trying to focus on healing. We began to attend church weekly and got plugged in with a marriage group where we began to attend Bible studies together and really dig in. While my relationship with God was growing and improving, things at home were still a struggle. Our oldest child began to experience more and more developmental challenges, impulsive behaviors, and out-of-control eating. My wife and I were finally on the same side, but there was still anger and chaos when I was involved. The start of 2020 was a turbulent time for my family. Rumors of COVID were just coming out of China. My grandmother would be hospitalized and pass away, and my wife would begin to experience seizures. These seizures would lead to her hospitalization and the discovery of a long-existing brain tumor. I was faced with the possibility of losing my wife and being left alone with my 4 young children. For one of the first times in my life, I would really start to turn to God. First in my anxiety, I would really start to turn to God first in my anxiety and stress at this point. With the support of friends and my wife's family, we were able to make it through this incredibly challenging period. We made some radical lifestyle changes. My wife would get to a healthy place. During this time, my oldest son would continue to exhibit additional challenging behaviors. We would start with adding a lock to the pantry to keep him out of sweets, then the refrigerator and the freezer so he wouldn't eat everything in the house while we slept. We would find wrappers from the freezer for pre-made foods, and in some cases, even raw or uncooked foods in his room or hidden around the house. He would begin to steal from us and from his siblings. It became nearly impossible to trust him. While my faith in God was growing, the fear and anxiety from those deeply ingrained family expectations was still there. I would have uncontrollable outbursts of rage and violent, unpredictable behavior, in particular towards my oldest son, but my wife and other kids as well. I would always blame others and refuse to take responsibility for my own actions or acknowledge the fear and anxieties that were truly driving them. My children were afraid of me. I began to become convinced my wife must truly hate me. I was going to fail to carry on the family name in a meaningful way. I had squandered all the opportunities I had been born into, and God had put in my path. I was dragging everyone down with me slowly, and my family would be consumed in the pits of my self-loathing and fear and anxiety. I talked with some of my friends, but was afraid to be honest with most of them about how I truly felt. I was the monster I'd always thought I was. Eventually, one of my best friends would invite us to CR to help him celebrate his 1 year of sobriety. I don't recall the exact step the lesson was on that night, but I know it was Pastor Mike talking. He emphasized the importance of healing and the impact it had on our children. I wanted to break down right there. I knew I had to keep coming so I could get the healing my mom clearly never had gotten, so I could be what God wanted me to be. My first step study was a bit of a mess. The guys were great, but we didn't quite finish it the way we were meant to, and I would struggle with admitting my need for help, refusing to reach out to people for a sponsor and dragging my feet almost every step of the way. Needless to say, even though we completed the work, we didn't really complete the study as intended. I would start to find some healing, but it would take much more time. My second step study went much better. We had a large, awesome group of guys, and I would find a sponsor who is just awesome. My first inventory was not fun, but it was cathartic in a way I didn't realize I needed. Acknowledging the things in my past I had made agreement with and just falsely believed for so much of my life. I am still very much a work in progress and still have aspects of my past I am working through, but my kids don't scream and run away anytime I raise my voice now. My anger and fear is still a struggle, but I am finding more control every time I choose to give those things to God. My relationships, both at CR and the outside world, continue to improve. I am making new friends, and my existing friendships are stronger than they were before. I am a work in progress, and will probably be for a long time, but I know what God wants from me now, and I will keep working at it through CR. I'm on my third step study now, and co-leading it at that. At the church I go to, I serve as an usher once a month and stay involved with the men's group and family functions there. While the uncertain boy who sat with his mom in church so many years ago is mostly gone, I still have moments of uncertainty, but I'm working to grow my knowledge of and relationship with God on a regular basis. I would encourage the first-timer to CR to dig in and keep coming. Being vulnerable with people is really hard, but when we can let go of our pride and be honest, we give God time to work. I think nearly everyone their first time is uncomfortable. No one expects you to share everything all at once. It really is okay to take your time, but it's really important to keep coming. The more you come to CR, the more things get easier as you see that ultimately we all have things in common, no matter how different our stories are. I want to go ahead and close by reading one of the Psalms that I find important. Psalm 40 for the director of music, a psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the proud, to those who turn aside to false gods. Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done. The things you planned for us, none can compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare. Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require. Then I said, here I am, I have come. It is written about me in the scroll. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, Lord, as you know. I do not hide your righteousness in my heart. I speak of your faithfulness and your saving help. I do not conceal your love and your faithfulness from the great assembly. Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me. For troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me. Be pleased to save me, Lord. Come quickly, Lord, to help me. May all who want to take my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace. May those who say to me, "Aha, aha," be appalled at their own shame. But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, "The Lord is great." But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay. Thank you.